Good morning, church.
Good morning.
It's been a great morning so far, hasn't it? And then we're going to do water baptisms, some other water baptisms. We have some other celebrations. We've got a belong party, and tonight we've got Seek First, our worship and prayer night right here at 6 p.m. So it's going to just continue to be an awesome day. If the day isn't awesome, I'm going to blame you because. Oh no, that's right, Brian. So we're continuing our series, the Jesus story. And we started a couple weeks ago as we dove into the book of Mark. We talked about this phrase. The story I tell myself about Jesus is the Jesus I tend to see and experience. So maybe I need to see him differently. And I'm going to add to that this morning. Maybe we don't just need to see him differently, but maybe we need to seek him differently. Right? We tend to see Jesus the way we've created the image of him. And we'll see that even this morning as we study chapters 5 and 6 in Mark. So you can go ahead and open up or turn on your Bibles because that's where we're going to start this morning. Is maybe we need to seek Jesus differently. Maybe the way we tend to see him is because we've created a narrow box for him. And we'll see through the stories in Mark chapter 5 and 6 how sometimes it turns people off when Jesus doesn't respond the way they think he should. And maybe you've experienced that in your own faith, that Jesus wasn't exactly who you thought. And that puts you in a place where you had to make a decision. So this morning, we're going to observe a couple things. We're going to observe Jesus' response with compassion and grace to situations of desperation and hopelessness. Last week, when we ended chapter 4, there was this moment in the midst of this storm. The disciples are in the boat with Jesus. They're crossing the Sea of Galilee. They get caught in a storm, and they're bailing water, and Jesus is asleep. And the question they ask Jesus when trying to wake him is, Jesus, don't you even care? We're about to drown, and you're taking a snooze in the back of the boat. But like we said last week, how many of you know if Jesus is in your boat, he's not going to let you drown? Jesus isn't going to die in a boating accident, right? He's got a purpose and a mission for you. And if you are seeking the true Jesus, you're not just going to ask him to bail water. You should ask him to do exceedingly abundantly above all that you think you should ask. Ask him for more. So we ended there. Don't you even care? Don't you even care, Jesus? So as we go through the stories, not only observe what Jesus is doing, but observe what people around him are doing, his disciples, the crowds. There's all these sort of different reactions we're going to dive into this morning. And I love chapters 5 and 6 because the miracles seem to get greater. Like the power and authority that Jesus comes with is encountering needs that are greater and situations that are bigger, I would say even crazier. Right? Because we're just coming out of this storm, and now we're going to read in Mark chapter 5. Read with me in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 1. He's going to meet a crazy man. So they arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrist and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night he wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. He was a cutter. That almost describes a generation of kids I know. When Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and bowed low before him. With a shriek. Did someone just shriek? With a shriek, he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Remember, we talked about highlighting titles that people are giving to Jesus. The demons recognize him, and they use another name that hasn't been used thus far in Mark, Son of the Most High God. They continued, "In the name of God, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already said to the spirit, "Come out of the man, you evil spirit." Then Jesus demanded, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us inside this man." Then the evil spirits begged him again and again not to send them to some distant place. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. "Send us into those pigs," the spirits begged. "Let us enter them." So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the entire herd of about 2,000 pigs plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned in the water. The story just keeps getting better. The herdsmen fled to the nearby town and surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran. People rushed out to see what had happened. A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who'd been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there, fully clothed, perfectly sane, and they were all afraid. Seems to me their fear had transferred from the man to Jesus now. Then those who had seen what happened told the others about the demon-possessed man and the pigs, and the crowd began pleading with Jesus to go away and to leave them. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. And Jesus said, "No, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been." So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region and began to proclaim the great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed at what he told them. People are always amazed in the book of Mark. I love it. So here's a demon-possessed man. We're told as soon as he encounters Jesus, the demons know who Jesus is, right? We've already kind of seen this in the previous chapters of Mark. But the demons know who Jesus is, even if no human does. They immediately recognize him. And did you see what the demons' response to that was? To bow. To bow. There was a recognition of his power and authority, and they recognized him as the ultimate judge with ultimate authority, because they said, "Are you here to torment us before the appointed time?" So they know there's an appointed time. Their destiny is destruction. There is an ending to them, and they know it, and they're like, "Are you coming ahead of time just to mess with us? What's up? We didn't have this on our calendar." Jesus says, "What is your name?" "Legion," they respond. Not just one demon now, right? We've seen a single demon in the previous chapters. But now it's a legion. And I'm guessing it's at least 2,000 because there's 2,000 pigs. I just did some easy math there. 2,000, okay. A legion, it's an army term for a lot of soldiers, right? And here is the man living in death. He's living in the cemetery. He's living in the burial caves, right? He's living among death. And do you think Jesus, by accident, shows up on the shore where this man lives? I don't think so. So it would be unlike a Jewish rabbi to go into a cemetery where he could be contaminated and become ritually impure by being near dead bodies. But Jesus isn't worried about that. He knows what he's about to encounter, even if the disciples don't. Right? So this is no coincidence. Here's a man living in death, so strong it says he can break the chains and the shackles that are placed upon him. Every human way to control or to subdue, every human way has been shattered until Jesus shows up on the scene. Until Jesus shows up on the scene. Things are about to change. And Jesus doesn't come with more chains. He comes with compassion. He comes with true freedom. Man, I hear so many people demanding rights and freedom in this world, thinking they're living in true freedom by doing whatever they please. But you're actually being controlled by a spirit, your own spirit, your flesh, your earthly desires. And you say, "Well, I can do whatever I please, whenever I want, and that's true freedom." And I would say to you, friend, that is not true freedom. You live in chains and shackles that you can't even see. But you know in your heart, chasing those earthly, fleshly desires that just led you into deeper sin, darker places, right? I heard a preacher say one time, sin will take you farther than you want to go and keep you longer than you want to stay and make you pay a price you never wanted to pay. But Jesus comes on the scene and he liberates the captive. He just says, "Be gone, be done." And he gives hope to this man who was hopeless. Man, I see a picture in this of a generation, probably every generation, but let's talk about this generation of young people living in death. Maybe not controlled by demons, but controlled by devices, by diagnosis, by all sorts of other things, maybe even depression, living in death. And they don't see hope, and they don't see any way out. But Jesus comes. But Jesus shows up. And Jesus liberates the captive just as he said he would. That's good news to the hopeless. That's good news to the desperate. There's this whole scene about pigs. And I'm sure I could take some time to talk about all the theological significance of the pigs. But understand they're in a Gentile area, right? They're not in a Jewish area. So the pigs are a form of income for the farmers. And they're pretty mad about that. They're upset that their livestock are destroyed. And they're not really celebrating this man who has just experienced freedom. And maybe there's something there about their materialism and not celebrating what Jesus had just done for this man who they tried to shackle for years. I don't know. There's something there, but we won't go there this morning. I will say that there's something about the unclean pigs. Pigs are seen as unclean according to Jewish customary dietary customs. But somehow the unclean pigs knew an unclean spirit when it entered them, and so they decided it was better to be drowned than to become bacon. I'm just saying. An unclean pig recognized an unclean spirit. And either the unclean spirit drowned the pig, because we know the spirit of Satan is to steal, kill, and destroy. So they either committed suicide or the demons killed them. I don't know which. The Bible doesn't really say. But we are told that the man, when all was said and done, the man comes to Jesus and says, I want to be one of your followers. I want to be one of your disciples. I want to come with you. I want to be with you. Jesus says, no, go home. Tell your family what the Lord has done. And what does the man do? He goes to 10 towns. I don't know if he's got family in every one of those towns. I've met some of you from Missouri. You got family in every town you go to. Oh yeah, my cousin Bobby lives there. Yeah. Where are you going? Oh, I'm going to Cape this weekend. Oh yeah, my cousin so-and-so lives there. Oh, okay. Right? So it doesn't seem that he has family in 10 towns, but he's going to go to 10 towns and he's going to become one of the first evangelists for Jesus. He's going to tell everybody what Jesus did for him. He's going to tell everybody how Jesus set him free when nobody else could do anything for him but shackle him and chain him up. Jesus set him free, and he's going to go from town to town. And instead of telling what the Lord, I don't know if the word there is Kyrios or Hashem in the language, but I know this. When Mark wrote it down, he said the man went from town to town telling people what Jesus did. And it seems to me that Mark is making the connection and wants you to understand that the man is telling people that Jesus is Lord. Okay, we'll keep going. That's pretty exciting. All right. Verse 21, let's keep going. Jesus got into the boat again. See how Mark just keeps moving? This guy is on a mission. He just wants to get us through. Jesus got into the boat again, went back to the other side of the lake where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. See how Mark uses these plays? What did the demoniac legion just do? Fell at his feet, recognized him, fell at his feet, right? So Jairus recognizes who Jesus is. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay hands on her, heal her so she can live, right? He's trusting Jesus. He's reaching out. He's desperate and hopeless. But wait, read verse 24. Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years, she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? His disciples said to him, look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, who touched me? They're so dense. But he kept It's true. And he kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." Let's stop right there. So there's two miracles, right? Jairus is actually going to be miracle 2. We'll get to that in a second because it doesn't happen first. But on his way to miracle 2, this lady interrupts. She needs a miracle. This is miracle 1, actually. She interrupts Jesus on his way to Jairus' house. And this lady has been suffering for 12 years. She's got a chronic condition. I don't know if there's a greater hopeless situation than when you suffer from a chronic condition. And I know some of you in this room suffer from chronic conditions. And you've just dealt with it. You've just held on. You've just pressed through. But look what she does. She's hopeless and desperate. And Mark, it seems, contrasts the crowd pushing in around Jesus to the woman pressing in to Jesus. Oh man, there's a lot of people who will crowd around Jesus. But how many of us are willing to press in to Jesus? A lot of us want to be near Jesus, but do we really want to grab onto him, hold on to him? How desperate are you? She's pretty desperate. I wonder if she crawled on her hands and her knees, weaving between the legs just to grab on to him. I want to make sure you know you're invited to come to Seek First tonight. When we worship and pray, we're going to press into God tonight. And some of you in your situations, and maybe just in your spiritual life, you just need to press into God. Then tonight's a time for you. It says she grabs the hem of his robe. And when we visualize it, we just think she just kind of tugs on his skirt. I don't know what to call it. Tunic, I guess you call it. Right? Jesus is wearing a long, can we call it a dress? I don't know what to call it. I think it's a tunic, right? It's open bottom. He's not wearing Levi's. And we just think she grabs on to the bottom of his garment. But if you understand Jewish culture and the role of rabbi and who Jesus was, actually it's less about him being a rabbi and him being a Torah observant Jew. He would have been wearing tzitzits, which are tassels that would hang from the four corners of their outer garment, which is like a long vest that would basically go from shoulders to the bottom of their garment. And at the bottom would be these 4 tassels, the corners of their garment. You might see observant Jews today, if you ever see the tassels hanging from their shirts, have you ever seen that? Okay, well this is kind of the same thing. It's called their tzitzits. And it was commanded in the book of Numbers, that they shall make for themselves tassels on the corners of their garments. The kenafim, it's called. That's a Hebrew word I wrote down. Why, Pastor Jeremy, why is this important, what she grabs onto? Because she didn't just grab onto his garment. She grabbed onto the promises of God. See, every Torah-observant Jew in those days, as well as today, they'd be wearing these tzitzits, which were reminders of God's commandments and God's promises. And I wonder if she's holding on to the promise in Malachi chapter 4, verse 2, what says, the Son of Righteousness, the Messiah, will rise with healing in his wings. The word wings there is the same word, kenafim. It's the same word. And so in her mind, if he's the Messiah, I'm going to grab onto the wings of his garment, the corners of his garment, the tassels that represent the promises of God, and I'm going to grab onto the promises of God. And that day, she experienced the promises of God because she was willing to press in and grab on to those promises. It says power went out from him and he knew it. Somehow he knew faith had accessed his power. How do you access the power of God? It's by faith. And this lady grabs on by faith. And somehow Jesus, through supernatural insight, knows power has gone out from him, but he doesn't know who, right? He's not omniscient in this moment, right? Jesus doesn't know who did it. He just has this knowledge that power has gone out from him because of someone's faith. And he says, who touched me? And what did the disciples say? Jesus, literally everybody's touching you. Literally everybody here has laid their grimy hands on you. Here's some Purell, Jesus. You might want to lather up. Who touched me? I think Jesus knew in that moment faith had accessed his power. And why did she fear? You ever ask yourself that? I'm always looking for the why are people fearing? Do they fear Jesus because, I don't know. But I think in this moment, I think I do know. Because she's ritually impure. According to the law, she'd be ritually impure. It doesn't mean she's sinful. Ritual impurity is not necessarily sin. It was just a state of being. Pure or impure, clean or unclean. It's not sinful. But she couldn't worship. She couldn't properly worship for the last 12 years of her life. She couldn't access the temple or make sacrifices. She was cut off from society. And for her to touch Jesus was to transfer her impurity to him. Most Jewish people would be like, don't touch me. I don't want to, because if you touch me, then I have to go through the rituals of being clean again, and I don't want to deal with that inconvenience. But Jesus doesn't mind interruptions, right? He's on his way to do something else, but he gets interrupted. He doesn't mind the interruptions. And Jesus doesn't mind the inconvenience. How many of you have ever said to yourself, I really don't want to trouble God with this? You ever thought that? Maybe you never expressed it, but you're like, well, I'm not going to really pray about that because, God's got bigger things to deal with. No, nobody's ever thought that? I think that all the time. Well, I don't know if God really cares about that. I mean, he's got, world hunger, actual problems. This woman brings her problem with her. When she accesses Jesus' power, it's by faith, and she transfers her impurity to him. But maybe better said, Jesus takes her impurity upon him. He's not scared. She is of his reaction. But what's his reaction? It's not one of vindictiveness. I can't believe you touched me. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go. Your condition is gone. Oh, you just need that breath of compassion breathed into you this morning. God doesn't mind the inconvenience or the interruptions. When you pray, understand this, your faith is more important than your words. She doesn't say one word of prayer to Jesus. She simply holds on to the promises of God by faith, and she receives her healing. So maybe this morning the word for you is keep pressing into Jesus. Keep holding on to the promises. Let's keep reading. Verse 35, because it was an interruption, so we're going to keep going. Verse 35 of chapter 5. While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now. There's another title for Jesus, teacher. But Jesus overheard them. Some translations say ignored them, maybe both, and said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just have faith. Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jairus, because he was still with him. Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, why all the commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep. Remember to observe what the crowd does. What does the crowd do next? They laugh. Really bad timing. This isn't funny. The crowd laughed at him, but he made all of them leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her something in another language. Talitha, which means little girl, get up. And the girl who was 12 years old, notice that the woman had suffered for 12 years, and now this, whoa, okay, all right. Immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally what? Amazed. Everybody's always amazed in the book of Mark. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. Way to go, Jesus. Feed the girl. She's nearly starving to death. That's not what killed her, though. That's a really bad joke. So this is miracle 2 that was interrupted by miracle 1. And when miracle 1 is just wrapping up, the people come and say, Jairus, your daughter's dead. Don't trouble the teacher. There is bad advice in the Bible. That's one of the things that is bad advice in the Bible. Don't trouble Jesus. And I love Jesus' reaction. Can I just get a little excited? It says Jesus overhears him. I love translation that says Jesus ignored them, which means he heard them and didn't give him any attention. Whatever. Boom. Gives him the, Jesus says, whatevs. He hears them and ignores him. I love that Jesus is eavesdropping. If Jesus is eavesdropping on your conversations in your house, with your spouse, with a mouse, you felt it, didn't you? It was like Dr. Seuss. Okay, that wasn't in my notes. But if Jesus was to eavesdrop on your conversations, maybe in your small groups, with your coworkers, would he hear conversation that makes him want to go, oh, I'm ignoring that? Or is he going to hear conversation that he goes, oh, that's faith. That's faith right there. Even imperfect faith, even messy faith he'll take, but he won't take faith that just says, don't bother him. Jesus wants to be bothered. He wants to be interrupted, and he wants to be inconvenienced. Take your prayers to him. And look what he says to Jairus. Just have faith. Just have faith. Don't be afraid. Just have faith. That word just, only have faith, you could say. Only. I've had Christians say to me in hard situations, oh, just trust God. Oh, they say something like this, let go and let God. I don't know what that means. I do think there's a moment where you release that fear and the grief and the heartache and the frustration, and you go, okay, God, I'm just going to trust you. Even if you don't know what that looks like, especially because you don't know what it looks like. Just have faith. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I've proved him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for faith to trust him more. Jairus had to trust him more in that moment than he did when he first asked, because now his daughter's dead, and there's no hope. She's not mostly dead. She's all dead. That's from The Princess Bride. Look what Jesus does, though. He stops the crowd. He doesn't want the people who are like, don't bother the teacher. He can't do anything, right? What's he going to do now? That's what they're saying. It's not just don't bother him. It's like, what can he do? She's dead. He says, leave them. They go. Dad's there, 3 disciples. When he gets there, mom's there, and the crowd. You have to know that in this context, there were professional mourners, grievers, who would come and they would play music and they would mourn and weep and wail and make commotions over the dead person. That was part of that culture. Jesus arrives and that's what the commotion is, right? And he says, hey, she's not dead, she's asleep. And there's probably some theology about what he's saying, but he's essentially already where the miracle has happened. In his mind, this is already a done thing. It's a done deal, right? Like Mary said, he's already been there. He's already ahead of this, right? And when they laugh, because he says she's not dead, she's asleep, and what's the natural reaction when Jesus says something that's kind of peculiar? Let's just laugh at him. They laughed at him. So what does Jesus do? He pushes them out. Hey, put them out too. Jesus is leaving all the crowds behind. Sometimes in your life, you got to push people out who are the negative people. Hey, God can't help you, right? You need people of faith around you. You need to gather people of faith around you in your moment of desperation. You don't need people who are either unbelieving and lacking faith, or you don't need professional mourners. And do we have professional mourners and grievers nowadays? Oh, I meet people like that all the time. They're always the victim in life. Oh, come on. Oh, yeah, because they have no control in their life, and they're always the victim because of some circumstance or this, that, or the other thing. And they're always in mourning, and they want to drag you into their negativity, right? There's always the naysayer who's like, well, I'm not a pessimist. I'm a realist. No, you're negative Nancy. And faith doesn't need that. Jesus is like, I don't need that. You don't need to be here. So he goes into the room with the 3 disciples and the mom and dad, and he simply asks the girl to get up, and she gets up. He raises her from the dead. That's pretty awesome. And then he does something very practical. I love how practical Jesus is. Give her something to eat, right? And I think from our Western culture, we're like, well, yeah, she's probably hungry because death kind of takes it out of you. It's probably true. But what is happening culturally is to prove that she's not a ghost or some sort of apparition, Jesus says, give her something to eat. When he's resurrected and he meets the disciples on the shore, he eats with them. How do you know he's not a ghost? Or how do you know she's not a ghost? Because if they eat food and they're a ghost, what happens to the food? It's just logical, right? I don't know if it's biblical, but it's logical. But that is why he tells him to get her something to eat. And here's another thing that you have to understand. When he takes her hand, it's very similar to when the woman with the issue of blood touches him. Jesus isn't concerned about ritual impurity of touching a dead body because he's about to take the impurity upon himself as the pure one. And he's conquered all of that. And so holding her hand does nothing to him. And if someone says, hey, you touched a dead body, he's just going to say, show me the dead body. Oh. No, you did. Yeah, you did. The Bible's really entertaining in my head. We should hang out more. All right, we got to keep moving because we got some water baptisms. Chapter 6, I'm not going to read 1 through 13. I'll let you read that on your own. But Jesus goes to his hometown of Nazareth, and basically the people go, we know who he is. We know who your family is. We saw you grow up. Oh, I babysat you, Jesus. And they basically reject Jesus. They're like, we know who you are. How could you be the Messiah? How could you be this miracle-working guy? And they reject him. And it says, there's a peculiar sentence there that says, and Jesus could do no miracles in his hometown because they didn't believe. And he says a prophet has no honor in his hometown. And I don't know why they reject Jesus the way they do, other than sometimes when you're so close to something like that, the hopelessness is taken so root in your heart that you can't possibly fathom that something so close to you is actually the hope that you should have and the hope that you want. And so they're so hopeless that they reject Jesus. And so this is, as you read through that, you can kind of see how Jesus responds to rejection to himself. And then when he sends out his disciples, he grants them authority, again, to cast out demons and heal the sick. And he says to them, hey, find people who are hospitable, who will demonstrate Jewish hospitality, and don't take advantage of it. Don't go from house to house, seeing who's got the, bigger swimming pool and the better food. He says, just stay where they welcome you, chill out there. And if they don't, shake the dust from your heels and keep moving. And I think that's a word for some of us that, one, God is going to release people in judgment to their own selves. And that's the worst judgment God could give you, is to release you to your own self and to your own bidding, because that will lead you nowhere but destruction. But also that we shouldn't clamor for approval and acceptance. And I think sometimes we are so caught up in that game of approval and acceptance. And my super awesome, smart friend Phoebe says, okay. People's rejection is sometimes God's protection. And that little phrase has been wisdom for me in so many situations, that people's rejection is sometimes God's protection. And so that's the word of the Lord from Phoebe to you guys. Thank you, Phoebe, for that. But we got to keep moving because it's 11:07. We got people to baptize. Jesus responds to hunger. This is a big miracle, right? So Jesus is moving on, right? And before that is death of John the Baptist, by the way. We won't read that. It's tragic. It's a foreshadowing of Jesus' death and what's about to happen to him. I'll let you read that. So verse 30 of chapter 6. The apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all they had done and taught. And Jesus said, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest. He said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. That's the second time that phrase has been used by Mark. He used it in chapter 3, verse 20. They didn't have time to eat because they were ministering with Jesus. Just remember that. So they left the boat for a quiet place where they could be alone, but many people recognized them and saw them leaving, and people from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, so he began teaching them many things. Late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can get food. But Jesus said, you feed them. With what? We don't have any money, they say. How much bread do you have, he asked. Go and find out. They came back and reported, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Then Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of 50 and 100. Jesus took 5 loaves, 2 fish, looked up toward heaven and blessed them. And he said, probably, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who gives us bread from the earth and feeds us. So they sat down. He breaks the bread. He gives the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. He also divided the fish for everyone to share. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. A total of 5,000 men and their families were fed. There's so much that is happening in this moment, in this miracle, and I've preached many times on that. But let's understand the context that they're trying to get away to eat. When the crowd stops them and interrupts them, they're hungry, and the disciples say, send them away because they need something to eat. How many of you know the disciples were probably like, we need to have something to eat, right? And Jesus says, you feed them. Jesus, we haven't eaten. We don't have nothing. It would take too much money to feed them. Can you just take care of this? Let's get going. But Jesus knows their need, and he knows the crowd's need. And so in this moment, when he asks them to feed them, he's testing them. You know, they just performed miracles, right? We just got done reading that they had been on this miracle and casting out demons tour, right? And they come back and they've just done all this, and Jesus is saying, hey, why don't you figure out a way to feed them? Oh, we can't do that. We don't have a context for that kind of miracle yet. Jesus hasn't done food miracles like this in Mark so far, right? So he says, you feed them. What do you have? Jesus is always going to ask you, what do you have? And what do you say to him? I have nothing. They come back and say, we got some kid over here in the kids ministry, and we grabbed his Subway. He had a tuna fish sandwich. Jesus isn't concerned with what you don't have. He wants to know what you do have. And there's a message of generosity in there. And here's something that I think was significant for me as I studied this week. They haven't eaten. There's twice Mark says, we've been doing so much ministry, we haven't even been able to eat. We've just been hanging out with Jesus, doing what he wants us to do. And now we're hungry and hangry and, that kind of, if you ever had kids do that. But look what they collect afterwards. What did they collect? 12 baskets. How many disciples are there? 12. How many baskets does each disciple get? If one basket is moving at 4 miles an hour, no. They each get a basket. Everything they sacrificed, Jesus paid back with dividend. Some of you are so concerned about what you're sacrificing for Jesus. One, you don't want to give it to him. You don't trust him with your finances because you're like, because I'm going to end up with less. No. When you trust Jesus, you end up with more. You always end up with more. I don't know how, other than it's a miracle. When you trust Jesus with your stuff and with your needs, he will always make sure you have enough. The final story, and I'm going to invite Mary to come up and start playing me off the stage. Immediately after this, see how Mark just moves on in verse 45? Jesus insisted the disciples get back into the boat. Man, they just been on and off this boat like crazy. Have you noticed that? Like, they got on the boat, they went across. Then there was a crowd there, so they went back to the other side. And guess what? Oh, there was a crowd there too. Oh, wow. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. So the disciples are in the boat. Where's Jesus? This is important. He's up on the hillside praying. Where are the disciples? Where's Jesus? All right, good. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard, struggling against the wind and waves. About 3:00 in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him, but Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then he climbed into the boat and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, thank you, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. There's nothing more frustrating than never making progress. And you don't feel like you're going anywhere. And here are the disciples struggling against the wind and the waves, trying to row themselves to where Jesus told them to go, and they're not getting there. And now it's late at night, and they're tired, and the wind and the waves just keep buffeting them. And Mark makes a point to tell us that Jesus is watching the whole thing. Isn't that funny? You ever thought about that? They're out there doing this, and Jesus is like, they ain't getting anywhere. Some of you have that feeling in your spirit sometimes that in your struggle against life, Jesus is sitting up on the hilltop just watching you for amusement. You don't blame him for the wind and the waves, but you blame him because he could do something about it, and you think he doesn't care to. But Jesus sees they're seriously in trouble, and so what does he do? He comes to them, walking on the water. Why? Because he's king of the water, king of all creation. He walks on the water, and he comes to them in the midst of them making no progress. There's three significant things that you have to grasp in this moment. One, Jesus is walking on water. That's a pretty divine act. Just have to say. But it's scriptural. Job chapter 9, verse 8, you should read Job 9, 8, and you'll see all sorts of Messiah connections and even connections to the water and the storm. But Job 9, 8 says, God alone treads on the waves of the sea. Right? So there's this God shot that Jesus is God. He's treading on the waves of the sea. And then Mark says, and he intended to pass them by. Are you asking? Yeah. Are you like, what in the world? Why would Jesus pass by? Hey dudes, I can walk on water. What's up? Right? Like he just walks by with swagger. What's up? You guys aren't going anywhere. Look at me. Boom. I'm doing it across the way. Are you ready for this? I don't think you're ready for this. When Mark says, and Jesus was going to pass by them, it's a reference to the two great prophets, Moses and Elijah. When the Lord was going to pass by them. It's an allusion to the divinity of Jesus. And when Jesus was going to pass by them, he was showing up and showing off. I am who I say I am. And so what does he say when he arrives on the scene? He says, don't be afraid. We humans always need to hear that because we constantly live in fear of something or someone. Don't be afraid. And then he says, I am here. But a greater translation says, the I am is here. Who is the great I am? Jehovah God himself. Jesus shows up and says, God is here. He walks on water. He treads on waves. And then he makes the storms to stop. And I think you need to hear that this morning. Read Job chapter 9. It'll kind of fry your noodle for a little bit. Jesus not only demonstrates his authority and power, but in Mark 5 and 6, he shows he's full of compassion and grace, and he longs to extend that to each one of us. Can I just hear a hallelujah in the place this morning? You needed to hear that this morning. I needed to say it to myself, and you got to listen in. Be people of faith. Let Jesus overhear you having conversations of faith. Let him hear about your struggles and interrupt him with every need that you have, because Jesus wants to be interrupted. He wants to be inconvenienced, and he wants to help you in the midst of whatever trial you're going through this morning. Do you receive it this morning, church? Amen. Amen.